I could have gone a lot.
Stay.
And I'm the imposter.
Thank you, friend. Hello, everybody. If I can ask you to please quiet down and take your seats so we can begin our next session. Thank you for joining us today. We have a terrific panel discussion ahead. I think it's a great follow-on to the conversation between Dimitri and Mike talking about China. And I'd like to introduce our panel, Jonathan Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation, one of our conference sponsors. Jonathan, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. NRF is pleased once again to sponsor WITC's Trade Conference. We have a great job, Ken, Diego, and the rest of the WITC team of putting together such a great event. I'm pleased to introduce this next session, China's global reach and regaining American leadership in the Global South. As the administration and Congress continue to focus on China-related issues, how U.S. competes for influence matters for U.S. companies who are looking to diversify with our partners in the Global South. We must be engaged not just for trade purposes, but as we try to tackle immigration as well. American engagement in the region is essential to support jobs and the opportunities that people are looking for. So with that, as Ken said, we have a great lineup today. We have the Honorable Nazak Nikakhtar, Ambassador Ted Osius, Ambassador Brian Nichols, Arun Venkataraman, and our moderator, Kellie Meiman.
Great, thank you so much. Honored to be here with this panel here today. We're going to try to address China's role in the Global South. The shift in U.S. trade policy over the last 15 years or so has really taken place in great measure because of China's rise and because of the concerns about national security and concerns about economic security, and those becoming increasingly intertwined. And we saw different administrations approaching that in different ways, right? The Obama administration, at least 2.0, pursuing TPP, RIP TPP, and then the Trump administration 1.0, really ripping off the Band-Aid when it came to China and concerns about them not following the global trade order rules and their pursuit of the 301. So we thought it'd be interesting to hear from our various distinguished speakers here what they've seen and what we can think about doing as a policy response to the current reality as it sits here today. So Arun, given that you were jetting around the world for the Department of Commerce only 22 days ago, really wanted to hear from you because you were traveling all over the world representing the U.S. What did you see? I feel like it's almost a tired talking point that the U.S. has lost ground to China and the Global South, but try to give us a fingertip sense of what you saw and the situation that you think we're confronting right now.
Sure. Thanks, Kellie. And let me thank Ken, Diego, the whole WITC team for allowing me to join this incredibly distinguished panel, and I'll try to live up to the reputation of my friends nearby to look forward to a stimulating discussion. I did just end this job, and it really was the best job in the world to have the privilege of representing the United States and advancing U.S. commercial interests and working with the most incredible, dedicated team of professionals who wake up every day trying to advance U.S. commercial interests and ensure our long-term economic and national security by doing so. And everywhere I traveled, I was actually quite surprised the reception we got, because what could not have been more clear wherever I went, friend, foe, in between, the reality was that countries and foreign companies want our business more than ever. We have so many counterparts, both in the government and in the private sectors overseas, who are not only open to American goods and services, but in many ways, have a preference for those American goods and services and for the quality and innovation that Brand USA stands for. But we need to do ultimately a better job of helping those partners make that choice so that they make that choice in our favor. And what we saw was that in some cases, there were situations where our businesses weren't showing up There were deals that were left on the table. There were tenders that were left out. And we did not step up. We didn't participate. And we can certainly get into the reasons for that. But there were, whether you're talking about dredging projects in Latin America, mineral extraction and processing in Africa, road and port development in Asia, time after time, would hear from our partners that they want American companies. They want American companies to compete with others, and they want to ultimately be able to select American companies. But there is a threshold matter of getting American companies to participate. Now, of course, in so many other cases, we do compete, and we know when we compete, the competition is fierce. And our companies are hugely successful in so many areas. But it should really come as no surprise that ultimately, particularly when we're talking about the global South and at a time when governments are dealing with constrained budgets, the price sensitivity matters. That is an issue for all of our companies, all of our goods and services. And we have to do a better job as private sector and government in laying out the value proposition for American solutions. We know we have the best in the world. We know they are worthy of being selected. But we also know that there are challenges in getting them selected ultimately. And of course, I think these challenges are naturally more acute in the global South. But even within the global South, we see differences, right? I would say from my experience, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Ted has to say about this, but when I look at India and certain parts of Southeast Asia, I see huge American success stories. In many ways in India, we're really buffeted by the fact that Prime Minister Modi's early recognition of the need to secure supply chains in that country, frankly, ahead of us, in ways that created more opportunities for American companies, where American companies have been in India but have been able to double down because of the actions the Indian government has taken that have made India a more attractive environment for American companies to do business in. So there's some bright spots there, but those bright spots, from what I saw, were really more the exception that proved the rule. I know we're talking about the global South, but I just want to make sure we don't forget Europe in this broader conversation, because we do need to remember that when we are talking about Europe, the competition with China in Europe and our efforts to outcompete China are just as fierce as they are anywhere in the world. Sounds crazy, but the truth is when we have, for example, a member of the European Union that feels compelled to select Chinese security equipment over American security equipment because of budgetary reasons, we've got a problem. If we are losing that game in Europe, needless to say, we are just sucking eggs elsewhere. So we've got to figure out how to do better on that front. So what do we need to do then? How do we get to a point where we can support our companies where they have to compete with China on all fronts? And I think we first have to acknowledge two realities to this. One is that shapes sort of how we ultimately respond. The first is the obvious that we all know, the recognition that unlike China, we don't control where our companies go. We don't control where they do business, whom they do business with. We have certain exceptional cases where we do put limitations, but as a general rule, we can't dictate where our companies go. But the second point is that we have to remember equally sort of at the front of our mind is that American goods and services, and especially our outbound investment, is increasingly, these are critical solutions for most of the development needs of the entire world. We have answers for virtually every development problem that countries in the global South are facing. And by virtue of that, we also have to recognize, first and foremost, that it is as a government, it is in our strategic interest for our companies to be the partners of choice for each of those global development problems. We should want all of our partners around the world to come to American companies first and foremost, and we need to figure out how to do that. Now, what does that mean? Well, this means a couple of things in my mind. It means we need to educate our companies about, especially the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, about the opportunities that exist in these foreign markets. There is no substitute for the on-the-ground market intelligence that commercial officers bring back to companies across the United States. Nothing can replace that. And when you have a situation where China has 3 times as many officers supporting their companies as we do, we're constantly in an uphill battle, and we've got to do better at meeting that need. We also, I think, need to make sure that and recognize that just because there are opportunities, it doesn't mean they're all commercially viable, right? Like, we know that our companies, again, we don't dictate where our companies go. They have to have a return on investment. They have to be able to create win-win commercial outcomes with each of their sales. And so we have to figure out, how do we help our companies do that? Because if our companies are not able to sell at prices that both produce meaningful profits and are within the range that governments can afford to spend, if we don't hit that sweet spot, we're not going to succeed. And so what we need to do is better coordinate our resources across the government to help our companies deploy tools that we have and then create new tools to help companies bridge that gap. The last thing I would say on this point is just that there's instances where we're not going to bridge that gap. There are sectors and subsectors where we are not active, are not as active as we would like to be. We still can't cede the ground to the Chinese or others. We have to work more closely with our partners to figure out, how can we strategically partner our private sector with private sectors from other countries to create the solutions where we might not have an obvious American solution, but where, working together with partners in like-minded countries, we can create solutions that the Global South can look to, so it's not always the natural default to China.
Well, thank you, Arun. So Ted, Southeast Asia is probably the piece of real estate that most has national security and in some cases sovereignty concerns around the China question. I was hoping that you might speak to us just a bit, because that region is just so uniquely sandwiched between the United States and China from their own national interest standpoint. How does the region just generally view our efforts to try to be or become the partner of choice in Southeast Asia?
First of all, the region doesn't look at itself as a counterbalance, but it likes to be looked at in terms of its intrinsic value. Arun mentioned that India and Southeast Asia are growing very fast. I would posit that they are the global engine of growth for the next couple of decades, in the way that China was for the past 3 decades. And the evidence is very clear. The fastest part of that growth is in the tech sector, where, as Arun mentioned, we have a lot of solutions. We have a lot to offer to the nations that are looking to move up the value chain, move from low value-added products to innovation-driven economies. 4 of our top trading partners now are in ASEAN. Vietnam, which used to be one of the poorest countries in Asia, is now our 8th largest trading partner. The American companies are responding. I work for the US-ASEAN Business Council. We have 183 member companies. They're invested in Southeast Asia. They're finding opportunities in Southeast Asia. They're making good money in Southeast Asia. And the region isn't kind of waiting for the United States to get its act together. The region is moving forward. I mentioned the strength of the digital economy. The ASEAN nations are negotiating a digital economic framework agreement that I think will set the rules of the road for tech, not just for the nations of ASEAN, but for the Indo-Pacific and beyond. They're also negotiating free trade agreements or upgrading free trade agreements with Canada, the EU, and China. So they're not waiting for the United States. They're part of the largest trade arrangement, RCEP, that exists on the planet. It covers 2/3 of the global economy. So they're not sitting on their hands. They're taking the initiative they're finding opportunities. and they would like to work with the United States. I think what Arun, there's one of the things that Arun said that I want to focus on, that showing up matters. And Arun and his boss, Gina Raimondo, showed up in Southeast Asia a lot, and it made a difference. And our companies have been showing up in Southeast Asia for a long time, investing in Southeast Asia, trading with Southeast Asia, finding opportunities in that part of the world for a long time, and it matters. And so, yes, we're the partners of choice, but we're not the only game in town. So we really have to compete in order to take advantage of this incredible growth and this incredible set of opportunities in a very dynamic, not only fast-growing, but highly aspirational region, where they see opportunities for their people to move out of poverty, to move into more and more interesting jobs, to drive their economies in new and creative ways, to take advantage of innovation, particularly in the tech fields.
Great, thank you, Ted. So Brian, you've got the biggest piece of real estate to cover here because you were ambassador to Zimbabwe as well as to Peru. And thank you for your service. For those who don't know, Brian retired last year after 36 years in the Foreign Service, uma vida, as we say in Portuguese. Would love to hear from you as far as, what have you observed firsthand as far as, how much ground have we lost in the Global South, in this part of the Global South, in Africa and in Latin America? Maybe we'll save Latin America for your second question, but first off, on the continent, how are our efforts to engage? We're obviously discussing AGOA now, but writ large, how are our efforts viewed, and what would you share with us from your life experience?
Well, thank you, Kelly, and let me just stress that I was only 4 when I joined the Foreign Service, so I still feel like I've got a lot in me.
We assumed.
First of all, don't hate the player, hate the game. We have to show up, as both predecessors have stated. We've got to be there on the continent. And I hear the same things from African partners as I do from Latin American partners, that they would love to see a U.S. presence on the ground. And when you look around Africa, you see gaps at the ambassadorial level in country after country. And we've got to staff those posts, and we've got people waiting for confirmation for 400 days or more. That means that our top salesperson is not there delivering a message. When you look at every Chinese embassy, you better believe there's an ambassador in every single Chinese embassy there, and multiple commercial officers. That's probably going to be their biggest section in the embassy. Maybe we don't need to match that level, but we need to be there with a commercial presence as well as economic officers to deliver. Key piece of what the Chinese are able to deliver across the Global South is a solution in a box with financing and implementers. And when we are successful in things like the Lobito Corridor, it's because we're bringing financing and an entire package along with a key U.S. implementing partners to make sure that projects are successful. And when an American company is the centerpiece, that means that there's going to be quality. There's a lot of complaining around the world, particularly around the Global South at least, that the projects that the PRC implemented in their countries 10, 20 years ago have failed to deliver in quality. And we have a great argument to make that rather than going for lowest cost, going for best value is what will deliver for the taxpayers of whatever country you're in and will be in the national interest of their country. And when you can have that conversation, it can be tremendously persuasive. in the areas where the PRC is particularly active, extractive industries and major infrastructure, we also need to work with partner nations industries because we can't always get U.S. companies to bid. The financing piece is important for them, but they're also overstretched, and they also need to understand the risk proposition. So making sure that information is available to them and making sure that our policies in countries are addressing the issues of risk, whether it's political risk, whether it's conflict, whether it's financial risk, all of those things need to be addressed in the region. And when you look at the array of PRC ports, roads, rail hubs, they've really focused on setting up an infrastructure that will take what they want, which is typically minerals or other commodities, and get them to China. And we have an opportunity to, one, help build greater infrastructure, because for all the work that they have done, there's still a tremendous need in Africa for greater infrastructure development. And a lot of the infrastructure that has been created hasn't been of the quality and the level that's going to be durable. So they're going to have to renovate this infrastructure relatively quickly, and this gives us an opportunity. We need to make sure that our commercial and our broader diplomacy are there, and I do appreciate the fact that a number of cabinet officials in the past administration, not just my fellow Rhode Islander Gina Raimondo, but Secretary Blinken, many others, Rita Jo Lewis from Exim, did travel to the continent frequently, but they need to do more. I'm hopeful that the current administration is going to look at that potential and take advantage of it. Not to jump to the next question, but certainly Secretary Rubio's having had his first trip with Central America and the Caribbean, there's great opportunities in Africa as well, and hopefully he will take advantage of that. Just the final note that I would make on this is, as we look for opportunities, we have to remember that the PRC is not 10 feet tall. There are opportunities and partners, even for countries that are skeptical of us. I was ambassador to Zimbabwe, but we were able to make a major sale for John Deere because they had the farm equipment at the price that Zimbabwe needed, and they were able to deliver it in a transparent and well-financed deal that was accepted by the Zimbabwean government. We need to look at all of these opportunities and make sure that we bring a package that's going to be successful, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brian. Nazak, given your background on national security as intertwined with economic security, would love to hear from you, in particular with respect to the experience that you had in the first Trump administration, as far as what policy tools were the most effective. If I'm not wrong, I think at the Department of Commerce, you were very involved in regulatory and trade initiatives in that regard. But given that Brian spoke to the financing piece, would love to hear anything else that you'd have to share with respect to that, be it Exim, DFC, angles, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm a substitute for the great Dan Runde from CSIS, and he writes a lot of great pieces on investment in developing countries, and he has a great book. So if you're not well familiar with Dan's work, please take a look at it. But going to the question, I want to really underscore sort of the political reality that there's, businesses tend to flock to investments in whatever region's the cheapest. But then there's also the reality that there's some regions in the world that are maybe a little bit geopolitically unstable than others, right? It's all a guessing game, But to the extent that those regions somehow go offline, right? Businesses don't want to be caught off guard. So just in terms of development, diversification, I think is key. And I want to start answering this question with a phone call I got a few years ago. A law school colleague who was former LAPD bomb squad, real decent guy. I trust everything. He's works in the Latin American region. And he called and he said, I hadn't talked to him for 20 plus years. And he called and said, Nazak, I see from your LinkedIn post you're really focused on China. Let me tell you that the Chinese are all over Latin America and Caribbean. They're buying land. With the land, they're getting rights to the air rights, and they've got the customs officials bribed, and they're smuggling in weapons. And this is happening all around Latin America and the Caribbean countries. Anyway, the situation is grave, it's dire. We need to be there because this is what China is doing. Obviously, China's access of ports around the world, strategic infrastructure. They're leveraging, China's leveraging its access to ports and infrastructure to then compel trade in the RMB. And when they compel trade in the RMB and away from the US dollars, they're going to more and more compel countries to trade with China only and not the United States. So we're seeing that we're slowly getting displaced from these regions in terms of trade. Obviously, Belt and Road, another instrument of coercion. China's investments, we tend to really undermine the extent of China's commercial investments in these countries. They're building schools, they're building factories, they're giving people jobs, but they're building schools. They're generating immense goodwill when the US and US businesses aren't present. And then they're extracting minerals and things from countries, pennies on the dollar, right? Just in a way, raping and pillaging these countries to extract the gains that they need from them. But as policymakers, you've heard there's real tangible solutions. In terms of trade, right? There's right now a shift away from free trade agreements, but more bilateral strategic trade deals. I think this is a great opportunity to work with all of the global South, right? The Southeast Asian nations, Africa, South American nations, Latin American, Caribbean, to do deals in energy, in raw materials, in digital trade, in commodities, right? As we're substituting, if we're going to be, as Dimitri pointed out, substituting away from China, we need to buy things from other countries, right? And so this is a wonderful opportunity for these countries to kind of step in and for us to help them step in to become a substitute for China. In the Trump 1.0, we had the Prosper Africa initiative, and we had this initiative called America Crusade. And what we were doing with Prosper Africa was looking to how do we bring some manufacturing into Africa so Africa could benefit from what its own riches in the country, economically benefit, rather than having China extract or Europe extract and take it for their own. America Crusade, we had MOUs with Latin American developing in Caribbean countries where we would help them build a regulatory infrastructure to make it easier for US businesses and international businesses, frankly, to invest there. We really have to do more of those things. At the end of the day, I hear policymakers always saying, well, we just have to give countries money, okay? We're not China. China's second largest GDP in the world, one of the lowest per capita GNI, which means companies, the people aren't making money. It all goes to the Chinese government. That's how they have the funding to money to fund everything. We believe in companies making money. We believe in people making money. Our government has less revenue. So we have to think more strategically about how to be in these countries. The US is on the brink. The center of gravity of critical mineral investments is happening in the United States. We're just a few years away from really having the capability, the IP, to process critical minerals, which China has the stranglehold over, process the whole range of critical minerals, right? If we can really achieve this, then we're able to provide our technology to the global, to the African nations, to South America, to benefit from their riches. The president talks about, I'm going to go in the north here, but we're going to take Greenland. Forget it. Greenland's going to become to us because the alternative is China processing their critical. This is a massive diplomatic tool. I talk about chips diplomacy, technology diplomacy, right? This is a real great way for us to loosen our export control requirements to help these countries build their capabilities. Remember, we built China into the powerhouse it is today. We can certainly build these other countries, and that provides us with enormous diplomatic wins. The final point I wanted to make is that as businesses, and you're looking at all of these options, seize the opportunities that we're trying to move away from China. The government isn't going to come up with a solution for you. They never will. They have way too much on their plates. But think of a solution, think of a strategy, take it to the government, bring it to the various agencies that have equities on this, show them how it needs to be done, but advocate for yourself, because if you just go to the government with problems, there's way too many problems for everybody to tackle. Go in with solutions, seize this opportunity, capitalize on these opportunities, and then the government is going to be very inclined and will have the roadmap to help you. We have enormous opportunities, we just forget that we do. And we've got to think about how our innovations are going to pull these countries in the U.S.'s favor. Final point, Arun mentioned the value proposition. When I was at the International Trade Administration, we would do these bilateral talks and deals with other countries. I used to say over and over again, when you do business with Chinese entities, you're doing business with the CCP. When you do business with the United States, you're doing business with American companies. If something goes awry, who do you think you have more leverage with, the CCP or the American companies, right? We operate in a transparent way through the international, tribunal system if there's a dispute. The value proposition's there. It's not just us throwing money at them, but we've got to really make the case for American businesses.
Zach, thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we all walk around with the America First Trade Policy Memorandum in our pocketbooks, but not to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing letter G, which I was super psyched to see personally. The United States Trade Representative shall identify countries with which the United States can negotiate agreements on a bilateral or sector-specific basis. So that's something we can think about when trying to build a positive agenda that I think you were alluding to in your comments. So thank you for that. Arun, would love to hear from you with your perspective. Obviously, under the Biden administration, industrial policy took a front seat to trade policy as far as a strategy for competing more effectively with China. I'm wondering if you could speak to the effectiveness of that strategy, where we need to take it from here, and is industrial policy alone enough, and or what other components of the strategy would you recommend that the United States pursue going forward?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that I'm happy to see that we are in a place where we're moving past stale philosophical debates about free markets versus other, the reality is we all live in a world now where we recognize that governments influence and shape the markets in which business operates, and that government has a role to play, and that we need to figure out what that appropriate role is, and to also recognize that the government has to, because of its influence, we have to shape that influence in a way, and in certain sectors that means really shaping it in a way that enhances our long-term economic and national security. I want to quibble a little bit with the framing of the question, because I think from where I sit, when you look at responsible industrial policy, it has to have that essence of intentionality, and I think that intentionality that we need to have nowadays has to begin with this understanding that done properly, healthy industrial policy is and must be a holistic enterprise. Industrial policy is not subsidy policy, right? Done properly, industrial policy is the through line that in every policy area we operate in, whether it's tax policy, trade policy, competition policy, energy policy, there has to be an industrial component and vision to each of those. Because that real industrial policy, and I think this is the way successful countries do this, is their governing and their policy making writ large is infused with the sense of supporting industry. Now, let's be clear, I think the role we have for industrial policy to be present in all of our policymaking areas does not mean that we become China. It does not mean we become a socialist country. It doesn't mean that we control our companies. That's not where we're headed. But there's a whole spectrum here, just as there always has been. I mean, when we think about the post-World War era, when we had debates with Europe about how market-oriented they were and social democracies, it's the same kind of question about where we draw the line. And I think what we recognize today is that we're not living in a world where commercial activity is somehow disconnected from economic and national security, but in fact, commercial activity is part and parcel and the pathway to economic and national security. So governments will have to play a role to maintain that security, and I think you saw that reflected in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. But while we always have to keep our focus on national security and do what's in our national interest to preserve our national security, I think we ultimately do need to recognize, and perhaps it's counterintuitive, but we do need to recognize that our national interests and our national security, our economic security, ultimately does depend on partnerships with others. We ain't gonna do this alone. I mean, this is really, whether you talk about chips, artificial intelligence, autos, green technology, all of these things, we're going to have to rely on, secure supplies from, partners that we can trust. We're going to have to rely on, co-innovations, co-developing that we do with trusted partners. We're going to have to rely on partners that work with us on export control and sanctions enforcement in order to ensure our long-term economic and national security. And I think from where I sit, that's exactly what we tried to do in the Biden-Harris administration. We did try to build these partnerships that recognized we have to go beyond traditional ways of thinking. As Nazak pointed out, trade agreements are great, but the world needs much more than trade agreements, much, much more. What the world needs, we're still trying to figure that out. There was a lot of, I think, criticism and concern about some of the approaches the Biden administration was taking, but we were very much trying to figure out what are the different vehicles and tools that we can use to get the kinds of partnerships that Nazak was talking about that go beyond the trade agreements. And so we did do things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Mineral Security Partnership. We did make active and aggressive use of our Defense Production Act to partner with Canadian and UK companies. We did do negotiations on critical minerals agreements. We did brand new commercial investment partnerships in Africa. And I think we did semiconductor partnerships in Costa Rica and India. We enhanced our partnerships on export controls with a bunch of countries. All of these, what's the through line through all of these is that in each of these areas, we brought, as much as we could, the full extent of the USG interagency and USG tools to bear, and that included, commercial matchmaking and policy alignment, export and investment project financing, development assistance, technical and policy know-how. I think we moved us in the right direction. We did not go nearly far enough for where we needed to go. I'll quickly highlight just two things that I think we should have and could have done better, could have done more of. One is, while I agree with Nazak that these traditional trade agreements are not the only way to go, I would emphasize that they're not the only way to go, but they are part of the way to get there. Market access still matters. Trade agreements, setting rules with our partners, setting those rules of the road still matters. And we need to do a much better job selling the case for trade agreements with the United States. It doesn't mean they have to look exactly like the trade agreements we've done before. In fact, to the contrary, I think the efforts the last two administrations have made have a number of elements that can and should be incorporated into modern trade agreements that look very different. The other thing that I think we need to do a lot better on is that coordination across the interagency. Having, whether it's DFC, XM, Prosper Africa, I think was a great initiative that I think needs to be built upon and seen in some ways as a type of model that can be reflected on how we can harness our energies across the U.S. government. But we need to have a much more focused effort on that because China does.
Absolutely. Ted, the next question for you is more with your US-ASEAN Business Council hat on, which you lead. So you are working with companies throughout the region and seeing what opportunities and challenges they face. Would love to hear from you whatever you're able to share as far as, real stories of what U.S. companies are facing in region, where we've lost ground, where we're missing the boat, and what can be done about that in your view.
While we're not doing as well as we might in infrastructure, I'd say we've ceded some ground in the kind of race to build infrastructure in the part of the world where I focus. But I don't think we've lost ground when it comes to tech or health and life sciences or financial services or even energy. In all of those areas, our companies are showing up in a very robust way. They're engaging, they're making money. Since we work with so many companies that are in those fields, we're seeing their successes as well as their challenges. I think I'm really interested in Arun's outline of kind of what is possible. What I still think we're missing is a proactive, positive trade agenda. We're pretty clear about what we're against, but we haven't been as clear about what we're for. And Arun acknowledged we haven't gone far enough, but we have found that when we show up, even on infrastructure, we tend to prevail. I think of the Luzon Economic Corridor that Secretary Raimondo championed, and she worked with military colleagues to make sure that happened. It was kind of bringing all the tools in the toolbox to bear on a challenge that for us is, well, for the Filipinos is economic, but for us is both security and economic. I want to come back to this infrastructure concern, because infrastructure isn't just ports and bridges, it's also things like undersea cables. And when we look at the kind of bifurcation that's happening in tech and the race, Nazak put it very clearly about what the Chinese are doing, and we need to be able to use all the tools we can to make sure that in this most dynamic part of the economy, that we are supporting our companies, that we're finding ways to make sure that they aren't outmaneuvered by the Chinese or invested by the Chinese. Our companies have what it takes to win, and we have to make sure that they do. The undersea cables matter because when our competitors are able to dominate the infrastructure, whether it's telecoms or undersea cables or supply chains, when you're talking about chip production that I think the CHIPS Act worked so hard to address, then we're not doing enough. If we're not making sure that our very innovative companies can't be part of the wave that's occurring in the fastest growing parts of the world. And we look at what happened a few years ago when we worked hard to kind of hedge in Huawei. That's a very dynamic company still. We need all of the tools. To make sure that we aren't edged out in this race for dominance in the tech field.
Oh, thank you, Ted. So, Brian, you mentioned Secretary Rubio's trip to Central America and the Caribbean. It's kind of cool to have a Latin Americanist as Secretary of State and to have that focus. Migration was obviously top of the agenda, but China was right there next to it, and in particular, ports. And Nazak mentioned, if you're doing work with an SOE, you're doing work with the CCP. Some of these ports in Latin America are state-owned entities, some are private companies. What can you tell us about the trip and what it taught us about kind of the approach towards China that we are taking and should be taking in the Americas?
Well, I think it's incredibly positive that it happened as the first trip. I think that our engagement with the countries that Secretary Rubio visited is very important. And it was interesting to me that he was visiting countries that want to be close to the United States. Their aspiration is a close relationship. In Panama, you've got a center-right government that views the United States as its indispensable partner. And I think that they were surprised by some of the statements that came out of the administration, given what they expected entering into this relationship. But we saw that they are very much open to looking at ways to increase the U.S. presence there. We already have a tremendous financial, tremendous commercial relationship with that country. And if you move up the isthmus, look at Costa Rica. We're similarly inclined leader. You've got a country that has decided to partner with the United States on technology, that's changed its laws to only accept trusted vendors, that's changed its laws for best value bidding. It's kept Huawei out of 5G in Costa Rica. Those are the kinds of measures that I think are important. But in the same vein, U.S. investment in Costa Rica continues to be robust because they have a level of transparency and reliability that means you can do semiconductor production in Costa Rica. You can do advanced pharmaceutical production in Costa Rica. You can have major bio and agrotech companies operating there. And that's a win-win because it keeps those companies closer to the United States and engaged in our trade relationship. Again, similarly, the Dominican Republic. These are, and also Guatemala. I mean, Guatemala is a country where they really view the United States as their essential partner. But we also have to engage those countries that may have less commitment to that relationship, and that means traveling throughout the region and swing back to Africa. I think it's crucial that we demonstrate our presence there and bring the full range of U.S. Tools to bear in both regions. The port infrastructure piece I want to come back to. If we bring the financial tools to bear, that's going to help American companies make these multi-billion-dollar, multi-year investments. When we were in Peru for APEC last year, Xi Jinping went to Chancay, about 80 miles north of Lima, to inaugurate the port there. And the Chinese have numerous major mining projects in Peru. We also did some things there that, new rail cars for Lima, the sounding rockets from NASA. There were things that we did, but in terms of scale there, we weren't delivering a multi-billion-dollar project. And so making sure that Development Finance Corporation, EXIM, the USAID are available to bring together a cohesive package around financing and risk, and that our commercial officers are able to lay that out both for host governments and for companies. That's what can be transformative in this relationship. The Mineral Security Partnership's been mentioned a couple of times. I think that is a really important for our regional security in the global South, whether it's Latin America, whether it is in Africa. There is a moment in time to pivot to greater U.S. access, and if we don't do it right now, we're going to be shut out of critical minerals. We've made progress, but we need to do more.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to get yelled at by Ken Nazak, but I'm going to give you 4 minutes, if I may. I know you've done some really thoughtful work and thinking around BRI and how countries that are interested in distancing themselves, and I know at least working on Latin America, the bloom is off the rose in some cases with respect to Chinese involvement. The bills coming due on BRI, promised investments aren't actually coming to fruition, et cetera. Share with us, if you will, some of your thinking on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one important thing to stress is that it's, any country who's entangled with China who wants to get out is going to face the wrath of China's retaliation, right? I mean, China's already banned some critical minerals to us and is threatening to ban more, right? We have so many supply chain vulnerabilities in China that, literally, we're not going to be able to build weapons or really advance things without those supply chains. So we're vulnerable. If we're vulnerable, those other countries are vulnerable, right? So I wanted to just make sure, as Brian and Arun stated, we have capabilities. We really just need to double down on capabilities so that when our trading partners are fearing retaliation by China, we can step in and say, no, but we can produce these things. You don't have to fear retaliation because you have an alternative. But with respect to BRI, I mean, I think it's so difficult for the United States to only feel like we can help countries who want to get out of BRI by just transferring money that they owe to China with that money going back to China, right? That's not a great solution. But we had a country, my colleague and I, we had a country come to us and say, and I say this because I want everybody to understand we have options. We had a country come to us and say, hey, I want to get out of BRI. What are my options? We pulled the BRI contract, which is available online, and it basically says China builds an infrastructure project. If you can't pay the exorbitant fees by the time China wants it, they can take any asset in your country. Any asset in your country. And if you don't like it, you get to try this in Chinese courts under Chinese law. So we said, well, this is interesting. Here's your way out. We're going to write an op-ed on this because we wanted to really spread the word. But we said, look, you institute immediate national security laws that prevent the China. So first you reduce the value of the investment, whatever you owe China. Let's say it's like $1 billion by all the environmental harm and all the other harms. Then you quickly institute national security laws and say you can't take any asset in my country like Osius, but you can have that, little $50,000 plot of land on the beach where you can build a sandcastle, but that's all you can have, right? It's legally viable. And then the Chinese are going to say, well, I don't like this. I'm going to try you in Chinese courts under Chinese law. No, you can't. Fraudulent inducement. The contract is null and void. If you want to try us, let's go to the International Arbitration Tribunals, which is the one international institution that has not been co-opted by the Chinese. Guys, for $3 million, approximating the cost of arbitration, every single country can get out of BRI, right? And I say this because we have creative solutions to help countries. And now, instead of the U.S. government spending billions and billions and billions of dollars, $3 million per country, easy peasy. We help them get out. We validate these international arbitration tribunals who haven't been co-opted by the Chinese and really foster greater relationships and help them.
Zach, thank you for that. We'll be looking for your op-ed. Share it with us. I just want to really thank our panelists. Ken, thanks to you. I do want to, just as we close, say we avoided talking about development policy and tariffs in this panel. Because we wanted to give a real snapshot of where we're at and things that we proactively and productively could do with respect to China and the U.S.'s role in the global South. But I did want to at least just close saying it's not that we're ignoring it. They're both very important. But really want to thank our panelists for your creative and thoughtful ideas today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kellie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kellie, Brian, Ted, Nazak. Really grateful to you. This is super thought-provoking. Big shout out to Kellie, who reached out to me to talk about how she could pull together this panel. So I want to encourage all of you, when you have ideas, bring them to us. They sometimes make it to webinars, and sometimes they can even make it on the big stage. So thank you very much for your help in pulling this together. Thank you for joining us. For all of you, we have a 20-minute window to get your lunch, bring it back to your seats, and then we're going to try to get restarted with Senator Tim Scott as soon as he arrives. So please head on out. I know you want to socialize, but try to do that while you're waiting in line, not just before you get in line. Thank you.